It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to pick up on a point that Harvey Feinberg made yesterday in his opening keynote presentation about the challenges we face moving into the 21st century. And in the course of his excellent presentation yesterday, he highlighted that one of the remarkable events that will occur over the course of this century is a dramatic increase in both the demand for and the production of animal protein. And in that, he referenced that there was both a positive and a potential negative. The opportunity for global food security was becoming increasingly more a reality. But with that increased production of animal populations brought challenges. We're going to spend time talking about those challenges, and we're going to talk about the opportunities. How to achieve global food security without inadvertently creating undue risks for both zoonosis and antimicrobial resistance. So, let's go. First, I want to start by telling you the end story. These are 3 take-home messages that you should walk away from this presentation. First, as we discussed yesterday, the 21st century is projected to be a period of unprecedented demand for and production of animal protein. And it's largely driven by the growth in populations and dramatic increases in household wealth. Take-home message number 1. Number 2 is that this growth comes with increased risks from zoonotic diseases and antimicrobial resistance. And point 3 is minimizing these risks will require a transformational change in how we produce, market, and consume protein. Hold those 3 messages in your mind. So, let's just revisit what has been a lively part of the discussion this entire week. A lot of the discussions have been about what the underlying drivers for both zoonosis and antimicrobial resistance are. And I'm just going to quickly remind ourselves about both of those. First, the drivers behind zoonosis. We understood, and Harvey did a brilliant job yesterday, reminding us that there are 2 real critical factors propelling zoonosis forward. That's the population pressures from the 20th and the 21st century, and where those population pressures are playing themselves out in the areas that are mammalian rich in terms of species diversity. Those are known as hotspots. We also know from the work that people have been discussing over the last 3 days that the emergence of antimicrobial resistance is an outcome of a complex interplay between human and animal health use of antibiotics and environmental interactions as well. So it's a complex interplay between animal populations, human populations, and the environment. So let's talk about population growth. We cannot consider any of these challenges that we're talking about without recognizing that the single biggest determinant for zoonosis and AMR and virtually all of the other health challenges and environmental challenges we have in the world today is population growth. And what I'm going to present you is a dynamic map showing population pressure changes globally from 1950 projected out to the year 2100. Watch this map because on the one hand, as we move from 1950 to the year 2000, and you watch the extraordinary expansion in population pressures, largely in Asia, it is coincident with what we also know about a dramatic increase in animal production and animal protein consumption. And it's also coincident with what we know about an explosive increase in the risks of zoonosis over the last half century. But as we move further into the 21st century, what we begin to see is that the dynamics of population growth are shifting. And while Asia remains a large environment for huge numbers of humans. What we begin to see is Africa beginning to expand its population, going from 1 billion people in the year 2000 to 2 billion people by the year 2500, and almost 4 billion people by the end of this century. Remember, the two biggest drivers for zoonosis are population pressure and mammalian diversity. There's no place on Earth with greater mammalian diversity than Africa, so pay attention as we move into the 21st century. What we also understand about the increase in animal production and animal consumption is that it's coincident with the extraordinary increase in household wealth worldwide. And what I'm going to present you with is the International Monetary Fund's projections about economic growth around the world over the coming decade and beyond. And what we see here, not surprisingly, is that where we are likely to see the single biggest increase in household wealth will be both in South Asia and in Africa. Again, in Africa, we're not only looking at increased population pressures of an unprecedented nature, we're looking at an explosion in the economic well-being of the people of Africa. We'll come back to that, but those two dynamics play themselves out in ways that speak to both the positive power of economic growth, but they also speak the risks of unintended consequences. So let's talk about feeding the future. As we look at that huge population growth and we look at the increased economic purchasing power, what does that mean? And what we're looking at, and Harvey pointed this out yesterday, but we're going to begin granularizing it. He gave us sort of a global projection. But what we have the ability here is to pay attention that when we look at this dramatic increase in production, we're looking at a limited number of countries where this explosion is most dramatic. First off, we're looking at, in the case of India and sub-Saharan Africa, the two biggest areas of increased production consumption between 2000 and 2030. Again, that's coincident with population pressures, but it also reflects where we expect to see not just consumption, but where we expect to see production. And what's most impressive about this is that where we see the most dramatic increase in production over the course of the next half of this century are the areas with the highest mammalian diversity, speaking to elevated risk for zoonosis. Understanding the dynamics of risk allow us to prepare for it and think about resolution. So hold that in mind as well. Feeding the future is not just increasing production, but we're also going to see opportunities for transforming the dynamics of production. What we're going to be seeing, most impressively, is a movement dramatically away from small farmers to industrial intensified production. And if you look at these projections from 2010, where we're looking at production across a section of countries that are the largest producers in the world, and we begin moving out to the trajectories over 2030 and 2050, as we look at this dramatic increase in animal production, we also see that it's coincident with a consolidation of production practices that speak to intensified industrial level production as opposed to the equivalent of backyard farming. That brings some opportunities, and it's really opportunities that are of a double-edged nature. On the one hand, by moving that dramatic increase in production from smallholders to large-scale holders, it creates opportunities for enhanced biosecurity. Anyone who's been working over the last several decades trying to bring enhanced biosecurity to small farmers has realized the challenge is extraordinary. But consolidating production in areas where it is more industrial, large scale, creates opportunity for consolidation and enhanced biosecurity. But what we also know, and we've seen this over the last half century, As production has gone to large-scale production, it's also been coincident with the explosion in the use of antibiotics. Now, it could be that, in fact, this increase in antibiotics was a transitional phase, because what we've begun to see among the large-scale producers is a recognition that as they increase their biosecurity and hygiene for those animal populations, there's a growing recognition that the use of antibiotics for growth promotion is no longer required. And so it's a possibility that as we move through this transitional period from small scale to large scale, there's an opportunity to introduce large scale production in ways that not only bring enhanced biosecurity, but also bring opportunities for better stewardship in animal husbandry of antibiotics. The opportunities are there, but so are the risks. Yesterday, Harvey also talked about how this increase in antibiotic use in livestock is projected to go if we do not pay attention to it. And what you're looking at are dramatic surges of 60 to 100% increase over the year 2000 in the level of antibiotic consumption within livestock industry globally. So the opportunity, as we think about letting these practices go out consistent with current utilization rates, will lead to a dramatic risk in terms of antibiotic misuse. So with that said, there are increasing understanding there's opportunities to better manage that risk. And there was a paper published by Carroll earlier this year that began exploring what the different model impacts would be by introducing different kinds of practices in the course of introducing large-scale production, and talked about targeted regulation, talked about meat reduction, and talked about using user fee. And in this model began projecting what the potential impact on the utilization of antimicrobial agents might be. I put this up as a way of saying that the unfettered use of antibiotics is not necessarily a God-given consequence of going to large-scale production, that there is some very profound thinking going on now about how you can achieve that large-scale production without exploiting the values of the antibiotics. So I offer this as a way of introducing what will be the topic for this discussion as we bring our panel. And it's really about thinking about the work that Carroll offered as a way of what are those options we have to rethink our approaches and strategies towards moving towards intensified production. What might be some of the options we have? And in his paper, he talks about regulating by putting a cap on antimicrobials. There's also consideration, which is to reduce meat consumption. And this is really an extraordinary question that really begs societal transformation about how we perceive meat as our source of protein. And what I want to do is just show you this one. When we talk about transforming how we consider meat as part of our diet, this is the current profile when we look globally at meat consumption. And what we have here is the excess amount of meat consumption in the world today based on current production and demand practices. The feasibility of expanding further into South Asia and into Africa, maintaining this level of meat consumption per capita clearly is an environmentally unsustainable practice. So part of our issues that we're going to have to grapple with are the practices of meat consumption in the Americas and in Europe today, the future for meat consumption as we move forward. A third has to do with levy user fees for veterinary antimicrobials, again, trying to bring better regulatory management on how antimicrobials are used. A fourth is exploiting the genetic potential of animal productivity, that using the genetic potential to reduce the vulnerability in terms of infection, but also to increase the weight gain that is associated with animal husbandry. And then to incentivize biosecurity, creating at the level of investment incentives that encourage large-scale producers to adopt practices that are consistent with sound biosecurity. And lastly, to capitalize on what we see are some of the generational shifts underway in different countries in the world. It's difficult now not to go into China and begin to see that the younger generation is far more, certainly the younger urbanized generation, is increasingly looking to access their meat not at live animal markets, but beginning to go to supermarkets and large vendors. So the opportunity is to say, are we at a transitional phase as we begin moving into some of these mega urban centers that also Harvey talked about? The societal shifts that may occur as a consequence of that may also create opportunities. These are issues and questions that really require our serious attention. If we're going to achieve the kind of global food security that the economic growth of the world is projected to achieve, the opportunity is for us to achieve that food security, but we need to be mindful, how do we do it without the unintended consequences of potentiating zoonosis, potentiating antimicrobial resistance. We have an opportunity. The curve in terms of explosive increase, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is just beginning to move into that exponential phase. How can we bend that curve in a way that gives us the benefits, reduces the risks? That is the discussion point for our panelists today.